Hi everyone, welcome to the Climate Confident podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Tim. Tim, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing, Tom. Thanks for having me. I'm Tim Weiss. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Optera. We are a software company that's helping large multinational organizations manage their carbon emissions.
Okay, and Tim, tell me first of all, why? As in, we know why, but why as in there's lots of problems out there in the world you could be tackling. What made you decide to tackle this one? Because you are one of the co-founders.
Yeah. Well, it kind of starts quite a ways back in my origins. Back in undergrad, I ultimately decided to study environmental policy, which was a mixture of economics, political science, and environmental science. And that wasn't a discrete intent when I started my undergraduate career. But as I went through, I realized that climate issues and environmental issues really were very fulfilling to me because they were as interesting and demanding on my heart and my mind. I think that climate issues are societal issues that we can use data to inform really discreetly, and we can understand and measure the impacts we're having on the world. We can use science, technology to improve in many of these areas. And I also believed that we have to use the tools of capitalism to fix capitalism, and realize that early on, that the ability to scale the meaningful solutions that we need to address the climate were going to be fueled by investments and decisions made in the economy and in traditional markets. And so as I navigated my college career, I found that a focus on really this blend of climate science, natural science, environmental science, as well as economics really suited my heart and mind and allowed me to focus my career in an area that was deeply fulfilling. That ultimately led me to my first job, which was actually during college and then after, was working for a nonprofit that was scaling solutions for people that lived without access to electricity in Southern Africa and on the Navajo Nation here in the US. And I actually went down and lived in Namibia in Southern Africa for a couple different stints over a couple years to really help scale their operations and provide greater and greater access to individuals that lived without any grid connectivity with renewable, clean, and affordable solutions that help them power their homes, light their homes, and have kind of basic fundamental access to energy that is kind of transformative. And so that was really my first foray into this side of things, into the renewable energy economy, into the clean tech world. Ultimately, my path to corporate climate emissions management and kind of really the really more scaled up version of this came after business school, when I had a desire to really think about how the economy is going to transform. And part of that was exploring commercial scale renewables in the utilities markets. I worked for AES and their commercial renewables division. That was right around the Paris Agreement, and found that I met my co-founders who had a boutique consultancy supporting large multinationals. And ultimately we started seeing kind of right around the Paris Agreement, companies really stepping up and setting more and more ambitious goals, more and more ambitious commitments that required a much more significant attention, data, and investment. And I was just excited by it. And I think that it was a way to really start to move the economy forward towards the low carbon economy. And I wanted to be involved. And so that's really where the origins of Optera began. And now I've been on this journey for quite some time.
Cool. And how are you helping organizations with their carbon footprints? What are you doing for them?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the way I think about this is we're now transitioning to a new version of how the global economy works and functions, and that produces meaningful risk and opportunity to all large businesses. And when you think about that, it has very little to do with whether they have solar on the rooftops of their headquarters. What matters is, how are their products made? How do they get to market? How are those products used by consumers? Does any of that need to change fundamentally as we move to the low carbon economy? if you think of an investor where you have assets, are those assets going to retain value or not as we move to the low carbon economy? How well positioned are you to be a successful enterprise through this transition? That requires organizations to have data across everything that they touch and influence, from their supply chain, from the logistics of how their goods are moved around the world, to their operations, and how, if they have, especially if they have manufacturing or any sort of kind of heavy emitting energy consuming practice under their tent. And then ultimately the downstream impacts of how their products are used, how they move through society and are used by consumers, and then also investors as they're all the things that they own. And so for us, we're helping organizations quantify their emissions across their entire value chain, which would include scope 1, scope 2, and then of course scope 3. And that's largely been our focus for many years.
And how are you doing that? Are you just, saying, well, you bought 10,000 liters of fuel based on your bank statement, so fuel has a carbon footprint of X per liter by 10,000, therefore your emissions are? Or is it something, is it averages? Is it calculated? Is it based on sensor data? Is it a mix of all of the above? How are you doing it?
Yeah, there are many different approaches that we all have to take to get a handle on different sources of emissions. So the easiest way to understand this is the operations side of things. So things that are within your operational control, you own the asset that is combusting fuel, burning fuel. You own the manufacturing process that's emitting fugitive emissions, or you own the facility that's consuming electricity. Typically, the source of data for us is going to come from utility data, where we're directly pulling data from all of your utilities, or we have, on-premise, if there's on-premises kind of emissions monitoring, we would be pulling in that data from manufacturing operations, other things. That data is really relying on primary data. And then we are converting it into emissions using kind of the kind of equivalence of how gasoline, given the efficiency assumptions of certain engines and kind of how they're used, how that would ultimately translate into carbon emissions or CO2 equivalent across many greenhouse gases. When you think about scope 3 emissions or supply chain emissions, the ways in which this has been done historically is using very high level commodity or industry averages. So an organization would be compiling all of their spend across their supply chain and then assigning it to different commodity groups. And then there's been academic research that has produced the average emissions per ton of steel or per ton of aluminum or things like that. That's helpful for organizations to get a first understanding of where risks might lie, or where the order of magnitude of the problems that they are exposed to probably persist within their organization's supply chain. We go far deeper than that because that's not actionable. You can't really pick up the phone and solve the problem when you have just a tons of emissions associated with aluminum. And so what we need to do is pair your supplier procurement information with direct data from suppliers, or even direct facility data where those goods are being manufactured and made. And that's what we do. So we're ultimately enabling companies to go past assumptions into direct data across their supply chain, their product mix, their investment portfolios, and really uncover which entities are responsible for those emissions. And we can treat them as an aggregate and allocate their emissions based on their share of revenue or things like that. But we can also go far deeper into which factory is producing these goods. If you're a large tech company like many of the folks we work with, and they're relying on Foxconn, we might have specific data on the factory and the factory line that's producing those electronics goods, and we can help really unpack the true exposure, the true risk, the true emissions coming from those manufacturing processes. And then the organization can actually engage with Foxconn to help improve those activities and really help them mature as a business. And that's what de-risks us. That's what helps us transition to a low carbon economy.
Okay. And obviously, scope 3 emissions are the most challenging because, not on your premises, it's somebody else's. Say I am a small to mid-size organization today. I've got, 1,000, 5,000 suppliers, whatever it is. how do I go out to all of those suppliers and say, I need your data in my system so I can figure out how to get your carbon footprint down so I can get my carbon footprint down?
Yeah, it's a massive challenge, and it's one that is a daunting prospect for companies that have never done this before. And the answer is you don't have to do that as your first move. That's not the
Okay.
first step. The first step is, and I can speak from our experience of how we approach this problem. We work with many of the largest automakers in the world, but also some manufacturers now that are brand new to this space have a discrete need to get better and better, more granular data on their supply chain. We have we have tens of thousands of companies in our database that have been reporting and sharing information publicly over many years. And we have unique partnerships with the Responsible Business Alliance, which is the largest trade association in the world that spans responsible procurement. And our platform is essentially the data surveying platform behind that association. And what we've done is help essentially define a standard single survey that all these organizations from Apple to Amazon to, Tesla and Ford and Volvo, all these folks now have access to, and send the same survey out to all their suppliers. That data then comes back in and we can use it in all sorts of novel ways with our customers and help provide, if for a very newbie into this world, it's very likely that we can provide really robust estimates for their suppliers if we don't have their data already, so that your step one is actually to quantify your emissions using as much close and proxy data or direct data if we have it as possible. And then you decide where you should target your efforts. And the best way to do that is to think about who are your top 50 suppliers that are most material, and what is their level of maturity today? What do you need them to do? Do they need to report better data? Do they need to actually set meaningful goals? And what we find is that most organizations have a pretty significant concentration of reliance among maybe 50 to 100 suppliers, and that it constitutes up to 90% of their total supply chain spend or total supply chain activity. And so we can really start in a much more targeted way and model the long tail, and we can get to the long tail later or never. With some companies that have hundreds of thousands of suppliers, you're never really going to engage with your 2,000, 5,000 supplier. And that's not really that big a concern because the emissions you're responsible for are just really negligible at that point. Someone else is probably a much more material customer to that business than you are.
Okay. And if I am going to my top 50 suppliers or top 100 suppliers or whatever it is, how do I get them to give me access to their data? What's in it for them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that what we find now is really coming to a head among many suppliers in the market, where the first step is they are likely subject to regulation, and what their customers are asking for is exactly what the market's asking for and regulators are asking for. In some cases, that's not true, and they may be a private company, a much smaller entity that is not subject to regulation discreetly. And the real driver in these markets is the overall sharing of risk. And so ultimately you think of data security as the first big example of this, where me as a company, if I'm going to go procure software and I'm going to put my data in that software, I have to know that that data is safe for us to operate, right? Because I'm now providing this third party with a whole lot of information that creates a whole lot of risk potential for my business. And so you're relying on that third party, that supplier, for protecting that information. The example in carbon is if you're a large automaker, you might manufacture just the final pieces, the final assembly of your automobile. If you're electronics company, if you're Dell and you are manufacturing your laptops, you might not even own any of the manufacturing process. And so your reliance on your customer is 100, like it's intrinsic to how you operate. There's no real other option. And so you can't isolate Dell's risk from their supplier risk. They're a true partner in this world. And what we see is that businesses, large corporations, are treating this partnership with that level of care and respect. And so they're trying to capacity build in their supply chain. They're saying, hey, we're in this together. You need to decarbonize. I need to decarbonize. Prove to us that you are a partner for us long-term, not a liability. Because every company now has to think on this multi-decade long horizon of saying, we're going to have to produce laptops in a low carbon, zero carbon way. Are you on this journey with us or not? And if a supplier invests in that relationship, if they're proven to be trustworthy and more of a partner in this, they get discrete benefits for that, where they might get a price premium. They might be able to sign longer multi-year deals. It is very entrenched in the transaction now, far more than it has ever been, because this is driven by market forces more than it's ever been, where companies treat this like true risk. It's a true kind of defining characteristic of how an organization needs to mature over the next 10 years. And they're really looking at their supply chain as one of their big problems they have to tackle.
Okay. And if I am a supplier, what's to stop me just, kind of wetting my fingers, sticking it up in the air and going 42? Or in other words, as the manufacturer or whatever, how can I know that the data I'm getting from my suppliers is trustworthy?
Yeah, there's a few different areas in which we address this. The first is there are more and more standards around verification, right? So actual third-party verification of data. And that's the first screen, is like, are suppliers actually going through that exercise and using a third party to audit this data, which provides a level of confidence in terms of the underlying methodology and the fidelity of the information. There's many companies that don't go through that process yet. And that process is pretty commonly now required in all regulation from Europe and California and others. But the other way we can do this is to actually use proxy data, use other companies of the same industry to assess what their emissions should be. And that is a remarkably accurate way to understand whether an organization has really defined their emissions or included and calculated their emissions using everything under their roof and not just kind of self-selected or done certain kind of small, portions of their business. And we find that there's really kind of nowhere to hide at this point, because there's enough information out in the world across every industry where we can produce pretty high level estimates of an organization's emissions using proxy data. And so it's quite easy to sniff out when organizations are not really going through the process meaningfully. And that's kind of taken time to get to this point, but we are very much at that point, I'd say, in the evolution of this market.
Okay. So do you see it as a market that is now becoming mature or still very immature, or where do you see it there?
I would say the easiest way to define it is maybe we're in the awkward middle school phase, where there's a whole lot of things and lessons that have been learned over the many years of helping organizations and moving standards in this area. There's a whole lot that still needs to get figured out. And a lot of that is going to is in narrowing the field of what's important. Right now, we are, in terms of how organizations are moving forward, we have many different directions that we see. And some of them are creating what I would characterize as kind of more busy work than meaningful work. And we have to get to a point where all of the work that's happening across a large corporation is serving the ultimate end of de-risking their business, eliminating the carbon emissions associated with their activity, and moving us towards a low carbon economy. We have quite a bit of messiness right now, where companies are asking for data in many different formats and shapes and sizes. And a lot of companies are stuck trying to respond to all of the different calculation methodologies, whether it be product LCAs or, scope 1, 2, and 3, or kind of other ways in which this data can be kind of constructed. And they're not able to actually focus their efforts and attention on emissions reduction and the actual changes of their business that are going to be, de-risking them long term. I think that we're we're getting close to a much more standardized world that's going to help businesses move faster. We're not there yet.
Cool.
And I have really the mission of Optera, we're trying to help make that happen so that organizations stop doing all of the busy work, the craziness of reporting, and actually can spend much, much more of their time on decarbonization.
Okay. Do you have any kind of customer stories, customer wins, we had this enormous carbon footprint, but then we had changed and now we have this tiny carbon footprint? Any wins like that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great wins that we can speak to across different sectors. The short answer here is there's no silver bullet for any organization. And so we have examples of, food retailer like Bloomin' Brands that, using data and systems like ours has figured out how to electrify all of their cooking operations. So essentially eliminating natural gas across tens of thousands of locations around the world. We have examples of helping HPE and Intel and Dell and Cisco and many of these very large tech companies essentially uncover where all of their emissions come from across their entire supply chain. And they are influencing the behavior of thousands of the largest manufacturing, electronics manufacturing companies in the world. And you were seeing really meaningful reductions, like 20, 30% emissions reductions across their supply chain because of all of that activity. And when you think about how that amplifies, HPE might be a certain portion of that supplier's business. And so, maybe it's 10 million metric tons or so, but the total impact of that is actually 10 times larger than that because it impacts that company's total operations, not just the portion HPE is influencing. And so the work that we're doing on Scope 3 is driving towards, tens of millions of metric tons being managed more effectively and reduced year to year, which I'm really excited about and really proud of. And that requires organizations to become much more strategic, where you're thinking about, okay, what are the long-term challenges that my suppliers have to manage? So one of the key ones in the electronics industry is the emissions from semiconductor manufacturing. When you have a fab and you're making a semiconductor, you're emitting greenhouse gases just because of the chemicals used in that process. That's a long-term challenge to solve. We have to figure out new chemicals to be used in chips over the long term and changing the manufacturing processes. That's not the first thing that's going to drive emissions down within a year or two. What we think about is how can we electrify as much as we can within that manufacturing operations and then apply renewables and batteries to really shift much, much more of that energy load to green, and renewable based electricity. And that has been the quickest, fastest move for emissions reductions across large manufacturing operations. So really thinking about, we've done a lot of work with individual companies about their own operations. I think that's exciting and interesting and cool. What I'm most excited about is the supplier engagement work that our team and product have helped facilitate across tens of thousands of companies across the economy and helping them all move incrementally to a more mature space. And whether that's, kind of some of the examples that I just walked through.
Okay, interesting. It is a maturing space, awkward middle school, as you said. Where to next? Where do you see this space going? This is the start of 2024. So, what do you see in 2024 out to, let's say out to 2030, given that is where, a lot of targets have been set for. So next 6 years, what's going to happen in this space?
Well, what I'd like to have happen is kind of what maybe I'll speak to is like what I think needs to happen for us to actually solve this problem. I am a relentless optimist. That's why I've worked in climate my entire career. I think anyone who's in this space has to be. There's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. And I believe that it's human nature to kind of procrastinate. It's also human nature to make every conceivable wrong decision before we ultimately finally make the right one, because that's the hard one to make. I think that we're going to do that. What is going to help move our sector forward is the level of urgency stepping up from markets to say, I need to understand who is going to be driving the economy forward towards this low carbon future and who's going to be left behind. And when real money gets spent, when real opportunity is seen from investors, from businesses to capitalize on gaining market share by being a leader in the low carbon economy, that's what's going to move us forward quickly. That is starting to happen in certain sectors. You see that some large chemical companies are really making all of their long-term bets in their manufacturing processes are all based on renewable fuels, recycled content, things that they know are going to be key drivers in the future. And they're not making bets on petrochemicals and, heavy emitting chemicals. And I think that's been pretty commonly understood. What's going to really transform over the next few years is the level of consistency across every large business and how they manage their emissions and report their emissions out to the world is going to be at a much more sophisticated level, which means everyone can rely on this data to actually monitor and track corporate performance. Greenwashing is going to be very hard to get away with. It's already much harder than it has been historically. And we now see regulation stepping up in that area where you're essentially banned from making carbon neutrality claims because we know that they don't hold water anymore. I think that that's the first indication of where we're going, where everyone's going to be far more data driven. It's going to look a lot more like the performance-based milestones and management of the financial sector that's now applied to carbon. And we're all able to trust and make decisions based on this emissions data in a much more discrete way than we ever have before. I believe that that's going to help drive a more rapid response and rapid decarbonization of the economy than anything else in relation to corporate climate emissions. And so I'm quite encouraged. I think that we're on the precipice of getting there, and I think we'll likely get there in the next couple of years.
Okay, so no more announcements from Apple that their Apple Watches are carbon neutral.
None. You might see them, but hopefully there's data to really back it up.
Fair enough. We're coming towards the end of the podcast, Tim. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't covered that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
Well, I think that the main perspective that I think is important here is we're on a very long-term journey together across the globe in marching towards a low carbon economy. And I don't want people to be discouraged by kind of missteps or imperfect solutions, right? We saw like offsets have taken a big kind of hit in the past year and a half. And I think that's necessary, needed scrutiny that's been applied to that market, because we need to understand the long-term benefits that we're getting from these sorts of investments in technologies. I think that the thing that we're balancing against that kind of long-term credible approach to things is the need for really rapid decarbonization. We have this kind of concept of like the time value of carbon, where 1 million metric tons saved today is worth a whole lot more than 1 million metric tons saved in 2049. And so we're going to have to find a balance of how we can move very quickly, but also hold ourselves accountable to a high standard. And I see that as a bumpy road, but it's important that we try to do both and manage towards both. So that what I don't want is to discourage rapid action across the board, because we're trying to be incredibly thoughtful and holistic in our thinking, because we're going to be too slow. I also don't want us to be just thinking super short term and fast when we're actually not producing meaningful outcomes. And so we have to have this necessary tension. I think people feel it that follow climate news. So they say, oh, I thought this was a good thing. Oh no, now it's a bad thing. And there's kind of this pendulum whiplashing effect, but that's us just figuring this out in a more genuine way. And this pressure to act fast, but also act in a way that is meaningful and also just for our society and for kind of everyone across the globe. This is probably one of the hardest challenges we've ever faced as society, because it requires so much coordinated action. And I look at kind of all of these tacts that we're making as effective, forward moving momentum kind of gathering activities. And I hope that other folks don't feel discouraged by these as much as they're feeling, okay, this is the next iteration of evolution for us in the market. And we're starting to figure this out even better now.
Okay, great. Good. Tim, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, so you can learn more about Optera and everything we're doing at opteraclimate.com. You'll find us on LinkedIn. You'll find me on LinkedIn. And, I'm regularly, writing articles in various areas, from climate, from the climate news periodicals and other things. So yeah, I'd be happy to be in touch with folks if you're interested in digging into these challenges. And so we're always looking for partners and forward-thinking organizations that are looking to solve real problems with real data. And so we'd be happy to connect.
Fantastic. Tim, that's been really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Tom, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.